Okay, today we have the new $550 GeForce RTX 5070, the GPU that Nvidia, Jensen, told us during their CES keynote would be delivering RTX 4090 performance. And that's the previous generation flagship that they charged at least $1,600 US for. Hang on, Balin, you're at CES. Did they actually...
Yeah, he said that.
This is meant to be equal to a 4090?
Yeah.
Alright, alright, hang on a second. I'll just... You know what? I don't think this is actually going to do it for this review. Okay. Let's do that. Come with me. Come on. Okay, so after the announcement, our social media accounts were blowing up. They were flooded with users celebrating just how exciting this next generation was going to be. 4090 performance for $550 US. That sounds pretty amazing to me.
Today's video is brought to you by the AOC Q27G3XMN, a fantastic bang for buck 1440p true HDR gaming monitor. The Q27G3XMN regularly features in our best 1440p monitor roundups due to its mini LED local dimming, providing an outstanding contrast ratio and great image quality for HDR gaming. It also has a 180Hz refresh rate, over 1000 nits of peak brightness, and a great budget-friendly price point. We highly recommend the AOC Q27G3XMN, and it's now available not just in North America, but other locations worldwide, including Australia. So to learn more and upgrade your gaming setup to HDR today, check the link in the description below.
Of course, the excitement was quickly squashed after it became clear Nvidia was using multi-frame generation to make these extremely misleading claims. We were quick to point this out in our CES coverage, but still, many came away from the Nvidia announcement expecting great things from the RTX 5070, and now we finally have it. And boy, is it super underwhelming. The RTX 5070 is just so boring, underwhelming, it really just pointless. So I'm going to shorten our review. I have conducted extensive testing, but I'm not going to go over all of the individual game data. It becomes highly repetitive and none of it is particularly exciting. But firstly, what I want to deal with is Nvidia's big old lie, the one that I just mentioned where they proudly claimed that the RTX 5070 would deliver 4090 performance. Obviously, this is a massive lie, and it's a damaging one that hurts features like frame generation by weaponizing it to mislead gamers. In a nutshell, multi-frame generation is just a more advanced version of single frame generation. Instead of generating one frame, it can generate up to 3 frames, which increases smoothness provided your monitor has a high enough refresh rate to show those frames. What it doesn't do is increase performance. That's because, unlike rendering more normal frames, creating generated frames doesn't lower latency. In fact, if anything, the overhead of creating the generated frames makes for worse latency. So no reduction in latency and no performance increase. The game won't feel or play any faster, but it will look smoother, with some artifacts thrown in. So in a nutshell, it's just frame smoothing, not a genuine performance boost. So again, generating frames does not boost performance, and therefore, no matter how many frames you generate, the RTX 5070 cannot become faster than an RTX 4090. Those kinds of comparisons have to be made prior to enabling frame generation, so let's quickly do that now. So, in reality, the RTX 4090 is actually on average 63% faster than the RTX 5070 across our 16-game sample at 1440p. But the lie gets even worse when we turn on ray tracing, as here we find examples where the RTX 5070 doesn't work at all due to the much more limited 12GB VRAM buffer. One such example would be Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, a game Tim strongly recommended that I go and add it to my RT testing suite, as the game uses path tracing and looks really great when doing so, resulting in a truly transformative experience. So I went about adding it to this latest round of GPU testing, but the only problem, at least for the RTX 5070, is that it can't actually run the game under these conditions, rendering just 13 FPS on average, while the old 4070 Ti Super was good for 47 FPS. And this is due to the fact that the new RTX 5070, a $550 GPU being released in the year 2025, only comes with a measly 12GB VRAM buffer. And this is the kind of memory capacity we would have hoped by now was reserved only for entry-level products, and that an RTX 5070 would at minimum include 16GB. Unfortunately, that's not the case. As a result, in this example, the RTX 4090 is 462% faster, and frame generation can't even fake enough frames to win here for the RTX 5070. In fact, if you were to enable frame generation, I imagine the RTX 5070 would be even worse because frame generation requires more VRAM, so that's going to be a big problem. And also, be aware, this isn't even native 1440p. We are enabling DLSS quality upscaling to try and boost the performance. And I should note, you can't even load the game at 4K using these quality settings. It immediately crashes to desktop. So already things are looking pretty bad for the RTX 5070. And while you could certainly argue that the GeForce 50 series has been a flop so far, whatever you think of the 5090, 5080 and 5070 Ti, I can tell you all three of those products are much better than the 5070. And for those who aren't up to speed with what the 5070 is, let's quickly go over the specs. For $550, you're getting a Blackwell GPU with 6,144 CUDA cores, 192 texture mapping units, and probably 80 ROPs. So that's 31% fewer cores than the 5070 Ti and just 4% more than the original RTX 4070 released 2 years ago now. Interestingly, it's also 14% fewer cores than the updated RTX 4070 Super, and the core clock speed is much the same. But making up for the lack of cores is potentially a 33% increase in memory bandwidth, as the RTX 5070 uses 28 gigabits per second GDDR7 memory on a 192-bit wide memory bus for a bandwidth of 672 gigabytes per second. So, 14% fewer cores than the 4070 Super, but 33% more memory bandwidth and an 8% discount to the MSRP. But as I've already noted, a critical attribute that goes unchanged is memory capacity. Like the original RTX 4070 as well as the updated 4070 Super, the RTX 5070 only features a 12GB VRAM buffer. So while the VRAM is certainly faster, the capacity remains the same. And no, speed/bandwidth can't compensate for capacity. It just doesn't work that way. So then, it's sounding very much like the 5070 is really just a 4070 Super with $50 knocked off the MSRP. But of course, I've tested a lot of games to confirm this, so let's take a look at some of them, and then we'll go over the graphs breaking down the full performance. Starting with Marvel Rivals at 1440p, we see that the RTX 5070 is a mere 3% faster than the 4070 Super, and just 15% faster than the 2-year-old RTX 4070. I haven't had a chance to update my 7900 GRE data just yet, but when compared to the 7800 XT, the 5070 is 16% faster and then 6% slower than the 7900 XT. Then moving up to 4K, we set the 5070 and 4070 Super are neck and neck, delivering virtually identical performance with just 44 FPS on average. Next up we have Stalker 2, and here the 5070 actually manages to be slower than the 4070 Super, coming in 9% slower at 1440p. This meant it was also just 11% faster than the 7800 XT and 12% slower than the 7900 XT. The 4K data is slightly better, but even so, at best you could say the 5070 managed to match the 4070 Super here with just 33 FPS on average, so it all seems a bit pointless. Moving on to Counter-Strike 2, we're looking at very similar results once again. The RTX 5070 is essentially an RTX 4070 Super, as both delivered near enough to identical performance at 1440p. The 5070 did pull slightly ahead at 4K, but even so, that saw it offering a mere 6% performance uplift. The Cyberpunk 2077 results at 1440p saw the 5070 come in slightly behind the 4070 Super, though we're talking about just a 2 FPS deficit when comparing the average frame rate. Still, that meant the new 5070 was just 7% faster than the 7800 XT in this example. Again, the 5070 does perform a little bit better relative to the 4070 Super at 4K, pulling ahead by a 6% margin here with 51 FPS on average, and this is without any RTFX enabled, and in fact, we're using the second highest rasterization preset. Hogwarts Legacy is a very bandwidth sensitive game, so this does help the RTX 5070 out a bit, and at 1440p it did end up beating the 4070 Super by an impressive 21% margin. So under the right conditions, there are some nice gains to be had, though I should also note that this did only see the 5070 match the 7800 XT. Now oddly, the margin did come down quite substantially at 4K, and now the 5070 is only 8% faster than the 4070 Super, along with the 7800 XT, with 66 FPS on average. The Last of Us Part 1 has more typical results for us, and that is to say that at 1440p, the RTX 5070 is a 4070 Super, both delivering around 90 FPS, making the 5070 just 2% faster than the 7800 XT. The 5070 performs a little bit better at 4K, though the average frame rate was just 4% greater than that of the 4070 Super, so very disappointing performance overall. The last game I'm going to bother looking at the results for is Starfield, and this is yet another example where the 4070 Super is able to outperform the new 5070 at 1440p. Granted, performance is much the same, but it's still very disappointing to see the 5070 coming in 3% slower. Even at 4K, the 5070 ends up 6% slower than the 4070 Super with just 45 FPS on average, so again, very disappointing results. Now, at 1440p across the 16 games tested, the RTX 5070 was on average 1% faster than the 4070 Super. So I guess that settles it really. The 5070 is basically a 4070 Super, which means realistically, for this to be a next generation GPU, it should really be called the 5060. But we've been down this path already with the 5070 Ti, the 5080, and to a certain extent the 5090, which really should have been called a 4090 Ti. And it's much the same story at 4K. Here the RTX 5070 was on average just 5% faster than the 4070 Super, delivering 3090-like performance. So maybe Jensen meant that the 5070 was going to deliver 3090 performance, not 4090 performance, so maybe he just misspoke or something like that. Yeah, that has to be it, surely. Now, I'm not going to dive into the power consumption stuff too much here, as power usage is boring at the best of times. And I know you won't believe it, but the 5070 is also a 4070 Super when it comes to power usage, consuming roughly the same level of power across the games that we bothered to check. Now, for the ray tracing benchmarks, we'll start with Metro Exodus, where the 5070 matched the 4070 Super at 1440p. Well, it was 4% faster, which is quickly starting to feel like a good win for the new GeForce GPU. It was also 8% faster at 4K, rendering 53 FPS on average, which I'd say is an embarrassing level of performance for a $550 US GeForce GPU, released in 2025, but of course the Radeon GPUs are even worse, though none of them were released this year, so I guess that's some sort of takeaway for Radeon GPUs. Next up, we have the Alan Wake 2 performance, and the 5070 sucks at 1440p with upscaling, only matching the original 4070, making it 15% slower than the 4070 Super, so that's a bit of a disaster, and we're only looking at 39 FPS on average. Increase in the resolution to 4K with quality upscaling enabled did allow the 5070 to match the 4070 Super, but now we're looking at just 22 FPS on average, so it's not really a win then, is it? Moving on to Cyberpunk 2077, the RTX 5070 continues its run of extremely underwhelming ray tracing performance, this time coming in 12% slower than the 4070 Super with 58 FPS on average. Oddly, once again we see that the 5070 is only able to match the 4070 Super once we reach the 4K resolution, or rather 4K with quality upscaling, but we're now looking at just 31 FPS on average, so hardly acceptable performance. The Spider-Man Remastered results at 1440p are CPU limited, but even so the 5070 wound up 14% faster than the 4070 Super, and like we saw in Hogwarts Legacy, this is another game that's very bandwidth sensitive, so that explains why the 5070 does so much better here. That said, there is some other limitation at 4K, as here the 5070 is knocked down to 4070 Super-like performance, which is still great performance overall with 91 FPS, but it's also very unimpressive when compared to previous generation parts. The RTX 5070 was able to just nudge ahead of the 4070 Super in Dying Light 2, though only by a 5% margin. We're also looking at similar margins at 4K. Here the 5070 was a mere 7% faster with 44 FPS on average, so certainly nothing to get excited about. The RTX 5070 is back to being an RTX 4070 Super in Black Myth Wukong, just 46 FPS at 1440p with upscaling, but at least it's not a Radeon GPU, I guess. Then at 4K with upscaling enabled, the RTX 5070 is completely useless, only matching the RTX 4070 Super with 25 FPS. Then we have Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, which was a late addition to this review, but I'm glad Tim suggested I include it to show off the RT performance of these new GeForce GPUs, because doesn't it just paint a lovely picture for the 12GB RTX 5070, just 13 FPS on average at 1440p with upscaling. Of course, you can dial down the quality settings to avoid filling up the memory buffer, but these are the ray tracing settings that Tim recommends you'll want to use for a truly transformative experience in this title. Naturally then, 4K is out of the question, and it's really out of the question as the game will crash and then refuse to relaunch on a 12GB GPU without using the safe mode, and then refuse to relaunch on a 12GB GPU with full RT enabled. You will have to load back in using the safe mode option and then lower the settings. So how future-proof is the RT performance of the RTX 5070, and maybe just performance in general with these new 12GB GPUs in 2025? I'd say not very by the looks of things. Now, because the RTX 5070 completely crapped out in Indiana Jones and the Great Circle with full RT enabled, I've removed that game from the average as we calculate using a geomean, and that's left us with just 6 titles. This still saw the 5070 come in just behind the RTX 4070 Super, though it's fair to say performance overall was identical. Then at 4K, it's slightly faster than the 4070 Super, though again performance overall really was near enough to call identical, and even with the help of upscaling, frame rates were generally very poor. Now, in a perfect world where the MSRP actually meant something, the RTX 5070 would actually be a decent value product, dare I say it. And that's of course if you look past the obvious VRAM limitations of this product, which will no doubt become a much larger issue over the coming years. But ignoring that real issue, I guess, the 5070 at $550 US looks pretty good. Certainly not amazing, but yeah, we'll go with good. It's 8% better value than the 5070 Ti and 20% better value than the RTX 5080, though of course, both of those products do come with more VRAM, and while it might only be the minimum amount of VRAM we want to see on these mid-range to high-end products, but at least those products do meet what we consider to be the minimum. It's also 13% better value than the RTX 4070 Super, so again, not an amazing gen-on-gen uplift there, but if available at the MSRP, it stacks up pretty well in an MSRP world. However, the RTX 4070 Super did see some small discounts applied in 2024, so if you bought back then, the RTX 5070 only ends up being 10% better value, and I think I'd rather give up 10% for 6 to 12 months of use, making an RTX 4070 Super purchase about a year ago the preferable choice in my opinion. Now, the RTX 5070 will have to contend with the Radeon RX 9070, so I think chances are we will see it hit that $550 US MSRP sooner rather than later. That said, here in Australia, the RTX 5070 is expected to cost at least $1,250 Australian dollars, which is a very poor price point as that makes it 8% more expensive in terms of cost per frame when compared to the RTX 4070 Super, which you could buy recently for $1,100. It also makes the RTX 5070 worse value than parts such as the Radeon RX 7900 XTX, 7900 XT, and significantly worse than the 7800 XT. In fact, the cost per frame when compared to the 7800 XT is 31% higher, and that's for a card with less VRAM, so that's obviously very bad. Now, before we wrap this review up, just quickly, here's how NVIDIA's Founders Edition version of the RTX 5070 compared to the Asus Prime and Gigabyte Eagle. Under full load, the FE model hit a peak GPU temperature of 72 degrees, whereas the Eagle was much cooler at just 63 degrees and then just 62 degrees for the Prime. It was a similar story when it comes to memory temps. The FE model ran at 76 degrees, whereas the Eagle peaked at just 64 degrees and the Prime at 68 degrees. Now, quite oddly, the FE model was reporting a fan speed of 2,350 RPM, though it didn't seem loud enough to be operating at that speed given the operating volume was 39 decibels. Typically, with this kind of fan speed, we'd expect the noise to be comfortably over 40 decibels. Still, the Eagle and Prime were much quieter at 35 and 34 decibels respectively. Now, the Eagle did consume 20 watts less than the FE model, which saw it clock almost 2% lower at 2,760 MHz. So it's a bit odd that this is the OC version of the Eagle, and yet it clocks lower than Nvidia's reference model. We also saw a similar thing with the Prime though, and although power consumption was reported to be higher, we still saw a slightly lower core clock frequency. Okay, so if you can't tell, I'm personally not a fan of the GeForce RTX 5070. It's a compromised product that will struggle to leverage the RTX feature set due to its limited 12GB VRAM buffer. And although that might not be a significant issue right now, I expect it will be within the realistic lifespan of this product. As for the general performance, it's nothing special. The RTX 5070 is basically a refreshed RTX 4070 Super with $50 knocked off the MSRP, for whatever that's worth. It can rub shoulders with the RTX 4070 Ti Super at times, but again, with just 12GB of VRAM, it's not a favourable comparison overall. Realistically, you would have just been better off buying an RTX 4070 Super 6 to 12 months ago if you wanted this level of performance from a GeForce GPU. 6 months ago, it was just $585 US, readily available, and if you want to go back 12 months, it was available for $600. So waiting 12 months to maybe save $50 for a 5% performance boost hardly seems worth it, which is why the RTX 5070 is so extremely underwhelming. But for those of you looking at spending around $550 US right now on a GPU, there really isn't a better option. Well, that is until the 9070 series is released tomorrow from AMD. The RX 9070 is said to cost $550 US, and AMD are confident they can deliver models at that price. The RX 9070 could end up being faster, it certainly offers more VRAM, so with our detailed analysis, along with a dedicated look at FSR4 coming up on the channel very shortly, I imagine it'll pay to wait just a little bit to see which $550 GPU is really worth your money, though I suspect spending the extra $50 on the 9070 XT is going to be the real answer. So make sure you're subscribed for those upcoming videos, and that is going to do it for this one. In a nutshell, the 5070 hasn't impressed us, if you can't tell. In fact, it's very underwhelming, though you've probably got that as well. Anyway, we're going to have to wait and see what AMD has for us before making any recommendations at this price point. That said, we have heard that the RTX 5070 availability is virtually non-existent. So reviews aside, if you want to buy a GPU right now, you might have to buy a 9070 series product anyway. Of course, we will have to review that one for you tomorrow. So you can purchase with all the necessary information. You don't have to just guess there or do any crazy pre-order stuff. The reviews are just around the corner. In the meantime, please like this video if you found it useful. You can subscribe because, as I said, we have more videos coming up, and then we have the join button and Patreon. But other than that, I am done with this highly disappointing review of, well, hopefully the review wasn't disappointing. The 5070 was. Anyway, it's getting pretty breezy, pretty cold up here, so I'm going to go get off the roof now and go back to my nice, warm, cozy studio. I'll catch you next time.